is we'll ask everyone to write down your questions, and we'll hold them for the end of the presentations. But that was really great. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Wilmer. So then our next presenter is going to be Tim Roberts, and he has been acting as the archaeologist for the work that's being done at Richmond Hill. So Tim, tell us a little bit about your work and what you're going to present today.
Sure. Thanks, Anna, and thank you, Reverend Wilmer, for this very detailed background of clearly some of the archaeological history and records history of St. John's Church. Richmond Hill is a very close neighbor to St. John's. In fact, the 2016 excavation that identified, among other things, a diagnostic Lamoka projectile point from the Middle or Late Archaic period is very similar to a Lamoka point that we just recently uncovered at Richmond Hill. So it really does speak to the very early Virginia Indian occupation of that landscape. So right at Richmond Hill, I've been serving as their archaeologist since January 2020. Our work's been sporadic, mainly because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The project, which is being undertaken through sort of under the umbrella of the Judy Project, was envisioned as a community archaeology project, in that the decisions that we were making, the questions we were asking, the approaches would be guided through community collaboration. That's been really difficult during the pandemic, unfortunately. We've done some very preliminary survey work. We've tried to do some outreach through platforms like Facebook Live. There's a very modest blog, a few panel discussions and presentations through Zoom. And the bulk of the archaeological investigation has been conducted auspiciously because of the capital campaign renovations that have been going on. So the investigations have really been focused in part on the what's been called the slave house, which is a ruin on the property formerly used as a shed and not recognized as the home of enslaved people. Very likely a place of domestic space as well as industrial work, which some of the archaeology is beginning to uncover. And I would invite Pam to speak in a moment. She's really the expert on the history of the property. I would just say as a start, the connections between Richmond Hill and St. John's Church are very, very interesting. The vestry records in particular that she mentioned, talking about the christening records and the marriages, I find particularly fascinating. I know from just speaking with Pam that we're aware of at least one one christening of what was believed to be the child of Lofton Ellett, who was one of the white owners enslaving people at Richmond Hill, and a woman named Amelie. And I sort of wonder, as an aside, I'm sure we can talk about this later, to what extent we know of the I hate to say status, but perhaps ancestry or identity in a larger sense of those who were baptized and married at the church. Also what that looks like legally and what those relationships, how they end up kind of through time later on. Really interesting interpretive opportunities there, I think, as well, for combining these stories in the neighborhood, as we're kind of focusing on a bit in this panel. So Lofton Ellett was one of the later owners of the Richmond Hill property. I believe he died in 1865. Prior to him, there were several generations of Richard Adams' family who purchased the property, I believe in the 1760s, from a man named John Coles, who owned the property since the 1730s. And as I understand it, Coles is buried on the grounds of St. John's Church, although possibly beneath one of the structures. Also an enslaver and an owner of slaves, and I would wonder if there's record of who was providing the labor to build the church and modify the landscape, and if John Coles may have been involved. And again, just these connections, so that enriching that the connectedness of this space, not just in terms of in enslavers and enslavement, but the people actually moving between these spaces, sort of spiritually and also in terms of labor. Archaeologically, though, the results are intriguing. We do have evidence of, as I said, pre-colonial Virginia Indian occupation. It's really limited to non-diagnostic stone tools, so mainly flakes of local material, quartzite, as well as non-local material like chert coming from the Appalachians, as well as rhyolite, also likely coming from the mountains or up farther north of us in the Northeast. But we do have evidence of the mid 18th century, so the mid 1700s, occupation of the property through the 20th century, of course, but intact deposits. And that's what's been really exciting. It was very exciting on the tours today that, even a mere, 3-4 inches below the ground surface, we have, intact 18th century archaeological remains of architecture that I think a lot of folks in the city may think that in Churchill, and as Anna said, the epicenter of enslavement in Richmond, Shockoe Bottom, are still very much preserved under the built environment of today. So something I keep trying to encourage folks to keep in mind as we're making decisions about development in the future and what our interest in preservation is in understanding. And I'd like to ask Pam to, if she's willing to, if the moderator will allow, comment on, just a bit more of the details of the history of the property, as, my head's been in a hole in the ground for the most part.
Tim, you do a great job of talking about it all. The only thing, because I really want time for the only thing that I'll just say to orient those of you who may not be familiar with the property, that there were originally 2 houses on the property. The first built in 1790 and demolished in 1928. Am I frozen?
He is likely referring to the Richard Adams' son and grandson's, the Adams Taylor House, which is currently standing on the property. It's a multi-purpose building at this point, also a reception center with an incredible view. It's an incredible meeting space, and I think Pam is there.
Oh, sorry about that. I could feel something was getting ready to happen. And then a second house, which we use as our conference center, that was built in 1811. So it's just interesting to think that as people come and go from Richmond Hill and we walk the halls, that those halls were occupied by enslaved people who were serving, various families. And during the Civil War, the Wilkins family was there. And the story of Judy, who was enslaved in the house, will be depicted by Margaret Joyner of the Heritage Ensemble Theater this evening at 5 and tomorrow at 3:30. So I've identified several hundred people, about 300 so far, associated with the property owners of this land. But of course, they owned other land too, and plantations on the outskirts of Richmond. And so it's hard to know exactly who was here and exactly who was somewhere else. But we do know from Jefferson and other people that left records that people move people around a lot. So somebody could be sent because someone's having a child, or there's a harvest or whatever. So this place was a part of that network for these 12 owners from 1740 to 1865. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. So, Tim, did you want to add anything at this point?
Well, I would just say, and I'm sure, not to get ahead of our broader discussion, but, as Pam said, Richmond Hill is really a node in a network. I think just as all of the sites that we're representing today are, and I think the opportunity to explore these connections through time is really special. The preservation on the property is pretty profound. And as a nonprofit, are doing a wonderful job managing it. And it's an honor and privilege to be a part of this program.
Thank you. Thank you. So as a moderator, sometimes moderators come in and say things in between guests, but for the purposes of our good conversation and questions section, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to go straight to the next presenter, and that is Benjamin Ross, who is the church historian at 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church. Ben, are you on?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well,
Go ahead.
thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this afternoon's program. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I actually did a successful Zoom on yesterday, but that's the electronic age for you. I will talk about the life of the Reverend John Jasper, who was the founding pastor of 6 Mount Zion Church. And I'll just go through his life. And we can hear, or we can certainly glean from his life, how he maneuvered through the city of Richmond. John Jasper was born on the 4th of July, 1812, on a plantation in Fluvanna County, Virginia. He was the last of 24 children born to his parents, Philip and Tina Jasper, on that plantation in Fluvanna. Although he was born in Fluvanna, he actually grew up as a child in Williamsburg, Virginia, because of the fact that he was and his family were property, and they were actually became a part of a dowry to the daughter of the plantation owner. She got married to a man from Williamsburg, and since they were her property, a part of her dowry, she took them all with her to Williamsburg to live. There was a death in the family, and she needed to raise money to pay her bills. And so she leased John Jasper out to Richmond as an industrial slave, working for a number of different slaveholders in Richmond. So around 1825, we see Jasper in Richmond, and he is working for different slaveholders. Many of them had tobacco factories, and he was what he called a tobacco stemmer, and he was pretty good at it. He worked for a while for a man named Samuel Cosby. He worked for a while in the Chesterfield coal mines when the railroad was getting started. But he ended up working for a man named Hargrove, who had a large tobacco operation in the city of Richmond. It ended up being Lucky Strikes cigarettes. But he worked for Samuel Hargrove for many years, and Hargrove lived at 2300 East Gray Street, right across the street from Richmond Hill. And the house had a slave quarters, and so we just assumed that Jasper lived in that separate structure for slaves. Now, Samuel Hargrove was a prominent member of the First Baptist Church in Richmond at that time, and I think he was a deacon there. And Jasper worshiped in First Baptist Church, as was the custom for many slaves, people who were enslaved, to worship in the same church as your white slave master worshipped in. And so Jasper was in First Baptist Church. Around the 1830s, Jasper was on Capitol Square in the midst of the 4th of July celebration. And that's when he had his first religious experience. It was an experience that he described. The light broke from heaven above, and he was convinced of his sins. He was working for Hargrove, and this experience stayed with him for several days. And it all culminated one day while working in the tobacco factory for Hargrove. He became extremely emotional, and it was such a nature that Hargrove had to call him into his office and calm him down. And Jasper explained to him what his feelings were. And Hargrove sent him home that day, told him, tell all his friends, family and friends, that Hargrove and Jasper were brothers in Christ on that day.
Oh.
And so Jasper did go on and did that. And that, in many ways, began his preaching career. John Jasper became a very, very popular preacher in the city of Richmond and around the state of Virginia. He began his preaching career first as a slave funeral preacher. The laws were such in those days that slaves could not preach or do a lot of gathering without the supervision of whites. And so Jasper began his career preaching at slave funerals. Now, these funerals were quite elaborate, and generally a white preacher would be the primary eulogist who would preach. And then after that, then he would let Jasper preach. And so Jasper, who did not have a formal education, but he did learn to read and write with the help of a fellow slave. And he, in his own words, it was difficult for him putting the hard words together, but he managed to succeed in reading the Bible. And of course, at the end, he was able to really carry the Bible all the way through. He got his skills. He certainly began his skills as a slave funeral preacher. And he was quite excitable. In fact, he was soon in demand to preach at slave funerals, not only in Richmond, but around the countryside as well. And he would, if he was invited, he would appear at these slave funerals, sometimes to the surprise of the white preacher, who couldn't believe that a black slave had been invited to preach. But they wanted to hear him. And so they sat through patiently the white preacher's eulogy, and then they wanted to hear Jasper. Jasper had a way of preaching that got people excited and got people emotional. And he was gifted with, he could describe things. His imagination was quite vivid. And soon he became very much in demand. He became popular. Everybody wanted to hear him preach. And if he had to go out of town to preach away, to be away for a couple of days to get to a location, the requester had to pay Hargrove $1 for every day that Jasper was away from the tobacco factory. Emancipation came. Jasper was in his around 50 years old when emancipation came. And so we find him now well on the way of being a very popular and well-demand preacher in Richmond and around the state of Virginia. He reached one of his major goals in 1867 when he organized the Six Mount Zion Baptist Church after the war. There were a number of old buildings, shanties along the James River, and we were organized in one of those buildings. It was described as an abandoned Confederate horse stable or a wooden shanty. And we started out with 9 members. They paid Jasper $9 on Saturday nights to preach on Sunday morning. So he always had some form of income coming in, if not working in the tobacco factory, certainly as a preacher. And you had to pay him, too, to come out to preach at these slave funerals. He didn't stay in the shanty or the horse stable down by the river very long. In fact, 2 years later, the summer of 1869, he had brought the congregation into an area of town that was becoming known as Jackson Ward. And we purchased a small building from a Presbyterian congregation who was moving out at that time in the late 1860s. The white population and others were moving out of Jackson Ward as African Americans were moving into Jackson Ward. And indeed, Jackson Ward got its official name in 1871. So now Jasper has his church. He has his own church, the 6th Mount Zion Baptist Church. It is the 6th Black Baptist church organized in the city of Richmond. There was already First African and Second African and Third African, which is now Ebenezer, Fourth African up in Churchill, Fifth African on Carey Street, and in 1867, 6th Mount Zion. And so he has his church, his congregation is growing, his popularity is growing. And in 1878, he unveils his signature sermon, The Sun Do Move and the Earth Am Square. Now, this was a sermon that hit like a bombshell. It went against scientific knowledge, and that the earth is not square, the earth is round, and the sun doesn't move, the sun is stable in the sky. But Jasper was a firm believer in the biblical text, and indeed there are several texts that allude to the sun moving or the sun stopped in its movement. And soon after initially preaching it, the local media, newspapers in particular, they got wind of it, and indeed, they, in many ways, promoted John Jasper and the Sun Do Move sermon. So whenever it was announced that he was going to preach that sermon, the newspapers announced it in advance. And so this was something to hear, something to witness, and indeed, thousands of people, black and white, rich and poor, young and old, in Richmond and around the state of Virginia, came to the 6th Mount Zion Baptist Church to hear the Sun Do Move sermon. Now, many people, they couldn't get enough of it. It was such an interesting sermon. But there were his critics that did not like that sermon at all. In fact, many African-American preachers at that time were the major critics because they just didn't like him preaching crazy stuff over at 6th Mount Zion. But the irony is that it continued to bring him fame. Jasper was extremely popular. He was given authority to minister to wounded Civil War soldiers at Chimborazo. He was given authority to marry slaves. And we see different things about his life that allowed him to navigate and move around the city of Richmond with a fair amount of praise from all of the people who came up to around him. He was known for parading the members of the church down to the James River for massive baptisms. There are several accounts of seeing him leading a parade of congregants through Jackson Ward, through downtown to the river. And indeed, there is an account of when the Free Bridge across the river was built. The endurance of that bridge was tested one Sunday afternoon with crowds of people looking down on the river to see John Jasper baptized in the James River. So he is, in many ways, all over the city. He is in Jackson Ward, where his church is. He is in Churchill, still working for Hargrave, living on Hargrave's property. He is down in the river, baptizing. He is in the tobacco factory, no doubt down in Chaco, in those areas. And he is enjoying a certain amount of freedom in many ways that many others, preachers and African-American men at the time, even free, did not have that type of of popularity and celebrity. In many ways, he was a celebrity. His appearances, again, were major events, not only at Six Mount Zion, but other places where he was invited to present the Sunday Move sermon one time at a bankers conference at the Jefferson Hotel. He was one of the headlining events there. And so he was really able to move through the city, but he was not without compassion for people like him who were free but didn't really know what to do with themselves. And so he started programs at the church to help newly freed enslaved people cope with freedom. Probably programs to feed you, programs to give you clothing, programs to help you get through what it means to live in freedom. And so we see that happening at the church. He also was a member of many organizations. There was an African American Republican Club. He was the chaplain. In fact, he was a chaplain in several organizations in and around Jackson Ward. He had an interesting private life. He was married 4 times. But only his second wife is where he had all of his children. About 9 kids were born. 3 of them died at birth, but about 9 kids were born on his second wife. And I don't know what happened, but somehow they didn't like each other. And so, he was able to have the church given a divorce. That sort of thing happened often in those days. People turned to the churches to settle a lot of their personal problems in those days. You didn't have a lot of lawyers fresh out of freedom. The church was really the center of a lot of things for free African Americans to turn to help them get their lives on the right track. And so with the Sunday Move, there are countless articles. Some students at Virginia Commonwealth University, when we celebrated his bicentennial back in 2012, compiled over 300 articles that were written about the Reverend John Jasper. Post Sunday Move, after the Sunday Move in 1878, there were just so many articles. And so the more you look at his life, the more he is an anomaly. He's just different from anybody else, and certainly any preacher. There are many white ministers could be found sitting in Six Mount Zion and not in their own pulpits, and much to the dismay of their own parishioners.
Sure.
And some of those
So,
ministers
Ben,
were asked to leave. Yes.
Ben, so I'm sorry, I have to interrupt just because we've got one more speaker, and I want you to save some of that.
There it is.
Save some of that.
I'll wrap it up. Oh, no. I
conversation.
got it. Yes. He died in March 1901.
He definitely a long life and definitely a celebrity. And that's definitely, I think, worthy of a topic of its own, actually, to talk about celebrities throughout the history of Richmond, because it's an interesting cast of characters, that is for sure. So our last presenter at this moment is going to be Nathan Hall. He's with the National Park Service, and he's going to talk about a couple of women who also lived in the neighborhood. So go ahead, Nathan.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, be invited to tell some of my particular favorite stories of these 3 people associated really with one place in the neighborhood. I'm a ranger at the Richmond battlefield sites and the Maggie Walker historic site. And when I got there, they seemed like the attitude was that these are fairly separate and sort of broadly connected. There's like a Civil War to civil rights message. But then I started pulling on threads, and the more you pull, the more you see that this is absolutely just an incredibly tangibly just contiguous story between what goes on before, during, and after the Civil War. So it's great to have the opportunity to tell some of the stories of my favorite Richmonders. I call them the Richmond resistance of many generations. A lot of my work kind of researching has been on finding the connections, the people that became sort of like spies during the Civil War is a lot of work of mine, but how they were socially connected. You know, these are all really people who knew each other. Lofton Ellett, you know, Pam Smith was sort of telling me that when she mentioned that name, I perked up because I knew that name from looking through records of people. So these are kind of a community. So here I'm talking about three unique individuals who really contributed immeasurably to the uplift of this community, and three people that are three separate, distinct stories, but they overlap in one specific location that connects a narrative thread of three generations. The era when emancipation was just a dream to the violent struggle that made it a reality, and the time that followed, a time when really hope and progress competed with some setbacks and some regression into the 20th century. And the site we're talking about, of course, is where the Bellevue School is, right behind St. John's Church. That block was obviously a home, a mansion, and quarters for enslaved people belonging to Eliza Van Lew, and her daughter Elizabeth is the famous Civil War spy ring leader. She is a woman who was ideologically opposed broadly to enslaving her fellow human beings, but to some extent was legally bound by her mother being the property owner, and a father's will was unable, for in large part, to manumit, but to speak about the evils of the institution before the war. And that was at a time and place when the term abolitionist wasn't just a casual insult. It carried potentially violent implications, and she was vocal at that point. And when Richmond becomes the capital of the Confederacy, of course, she becomes the leader of the band of Union spies and espionage agents. And so and that gave her an opportunity, as a person ideologically opposed, to actually really significantly contribute to the ultimate destruction of slavery in America through her efforts. The second person associated with that site, that's the pre-war generation. Secondly is Mary Jane Richards, eventually Denman, born around 1840, of course connected to St. John's, because one of our clues about her life is the baptism record of Mary Jane. In the 1840s, Mary Jane Richards was likely enslaved by the Van Lew family early in her life. For unknown reasons, she was sent to be educated in Princeton, New Jersey in her childhood, and from there sent across the ocean as a 15-year-old girl to Liberia. And she spent about 5 years there before deciding she wanted to return to Virginia, which is, you know, knowing what the situation is in Virginia in 1860 is a interesting decision, and comes back here right when the Civil War begins. So suddenly finding herself a young woman who had been at least nominally free and now trapped in the epicenter of a slaveholders' republic that's been founded to preserve that institution. Her response to that was to become a fighter in that war. She brought food supplies to American soldiers who were prisoners in Richmond. She helped them get out of prison and escape, and provided military intelligence. When the war ended, she made use of the education she had to educate others. She taught for Northern aid organizations here in Richmond, including at the site of the Ebenezer Church today and the First African Baptist Church. Eventually taught for the Freedmen's Bureau in Georgia. Her connection to Churchill ended shortly after the Civil War, when she finally had the freedom to leave Richmond. She did, first Georgia, then New York, where she became Mary Denman. This is a woman who knew slavery as a child. As a young adult, she saw it end with her help. And then in that instance made one of the most tangible contributions somebody possibly could in the years after. Namely, she provided the knowledge of reading and writing and education for dozens or hundreds of among the millions who had been denied that opportunity for generations before. And in that same space, in that block, on Gray Street, a child came into the world while the Civil War was raging all around in 1864. Child of Elizabeth Draper, an assistant to the cook in that Van Lew house. She gave birth to Maggie Lena Draper. That child came into the world at the time of slavery. She was possibly born enslaved herself, and she would be among the first generation of African Americans who really grew up never experiencing it firsthand. She didn't have the firsthand memory of being enslaved, but the living memory of it was always present in her household. Her mother always lived with her. So her mother's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, 4 generations of the living memory were in that household into the 20th century. When, with her mother's marriage, Maggie Draper became Maggie Mitchell and grew up in the era of where public education was first available in Richmond. And with her own marriage in 1866, of course, she became Maggie L. Walker, a among her classmates in that generation were doctors, publishers, artists, musicians, an entire generation of the people who were born in the hopeful time right around when slavery was ending, so that as they become adults and that repressive Jim Crow era of legislation begins, they were the ones who they knew that it didn't have to be that way. And so they're the ones who fought back. Maggie Walker, of course, devoted her life to service and community empowerment, first through First African Baptist Church, where she's a member, and then to the religious fraternal organization, the Independent Order of St. Luke. The success of that organization led to the creation of the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank in 1903. That's the first paragraph of her Wikipedia, the big thing in the history book. She's the first Black woman in America to charter a bank and serve as its president. Her public life also includes newspaper publishing, department store, political, and voting rights activism. Her remarkable 70-year life began under the nominal leadership of Jefferson Davis and ended under the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt. So a heck of a span. It spanned the end of American slavery, Reconstruction, the height of Jim Crow, and that life laid the groundwork for the 20th century civil rights movement that would emerge in the next generation. And the last quick thing I want to mention is also in the neighborhood is Chimborazo, which has already been mentioned because of Reverend Jasper's connection. But just a few blocks away, 31st and Broad, that big open park, was that Confederate hospital. It was 100 buildings that served 70,000 patients during the Civil War, administered primarily by an enslaved workforce, 200 to 300 enslaved African-American nurses and laborers. On April 3rd, 1865, those workers were acknowledged along with the tens of thousands of others in Richmond to be forever free. And what comes next? The day before, it was illegal in Virginia for African Americans to be taught to read and write. So with emancipation's arrival, that law is dead, and that work immediately began in earnest, and it began at Chimborazo. Those 100 buildings were administered by the Freedmen's Bureau. They became housing for the formerly enslaved, and a school. 350 students from ages 4 to 28 began their education there. And just to kind of connect the place to some of those people and connections, a friend of Elizabeth Van Lew was there, Dr. Edwin Smith. He was the medical director of the Freedmen's Bureau at Chimborazo, and she worked there briefly after the war as well. She's not here anymore, but I wanted to credit Lois Levine because she found that little tidbit that sent me on the search for Dr. Smith, who was a Confederate surgeon who immediately switched and was a Freedmen's Bureau surgeon and friend of Van Lew. Dr. Smith brought William Mitchell to Richmond during the war as an enslaved worker. After the end of the war, secured William Mitchell's freedom. He moved into the Van Lew house and became a butler. Shortly thereafter, he became stepfather to the future Maggie Walker. And Mary Jane Richards, then Denman, absent from Richmond, then operated a similar school in Georgia, which brought that same opportunity to the more distant land. So that is my brief thing, a remarkable set of stories of 3 of Richmond's most notable, intriguing, inspiring women we've ever had, all with an overlapping connection of distinctive lives and unique perspectives on the meaning of emancipation in that space. Thank you.
Okay, so that was incredible. All of these stories, I was just sitting here thinking about the fact that you can, in this sort of, I don't know, 3-4 square block, maybe it's only 2 square blocks, that you can tell the story of Richmond from 5,000 years ago, right up to the present. But, for our purposes to talk about this 18th, 19th century era, about Richmond in a way that that really does connect a lot of dots. Our questions about what slavery and emancipation means, and also the ways in which Black people worked through those circumstances to carve out their personal viewpoint, on the world, and have an effect on each other because they figured things out for themselves. They had a way of seeing things, and very often that became a vocation, or it became an event, or something. But it's all right there in that, just those few square blocks right up on Church Hill. And of course, I connected to, what's going on down below in Shockoe Bottom. In 1799, when the St. John's Church expands its property in order to be able to have more burials, it's almost the same town council meeting where they legislate the purchase of the property down in the bottom that became the African burial ground, or what they refer to as the burial ground for Negroes. 1 year later, Gabriel's Rebellion takes place. So, the idea that the ways in which the many, many, many kinds of lives that Black people are living all at the same time in proximity to each other, and how each of them describes an aspect of colonial or early national, early republic life in Richmond. It's really incredible that you can do that, you know, with such a tight geography. So at this point, I know we're probably close or past time. Tam, you're going to have to advise us on this point. Do we have time for any questions?
Yes, let's take a few minutes. If you need to leave, we're so happy that you came, but if you can save for a few questions, that would be great.
So let's see. And so that means if you have a question, you need to unmute yourself and start talking, or post it in the chat, and we will be delighted to get it to the person who needs to answer it. And I'll also take the pressure off. If you don't have any questions right now, that's okay. There's been a lot that's been delivered to you in the course of this session, and just an amazing set of overlaps and intersections, and incredible people. So if you don't have questions right now, that's okay. I know that there's a really cool program coming up at 5 o'clock, and you can always send your questions, call Richmond Hill, note all of these people that have just given you this good information, and reach out to them individually as well for this information.
Anna, yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
This is Joel, and I'm in the parking lot at Richmond Hill. I want to thank everybody for being here, but we have someone here who has a question for Benjamin.
Great.
Oh,
Hi, I just came up and parked, and I can tell everybody you have to be here by 5 o'clock. The energy is so great, and Jim is so helpful. So he had this on, and I started listening to it. So I came in when Benjamin Rose was speaking, or Ross? Ross. And he said there was a mind-boggling sermon by Jasper that changed the mindset or something like that. Is it possible to give me the title of that sermon so I could read it?
well, yes. That sermon is called "The Sun Do Move, the Earth Am Square."
I'm baffled
And,
even
sure,
by
you-
writing this down. So can you just
The sun
bear
do
with
move.
the sun do move?
I put it in the
Earth.
chat as
Got
well.
it in the chat.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Even the title is mind-boggling. That's why I couldn't follow it, because I am European, and so English is not my first language. And I was just baffled by all this information. I am so thankful for this program.
Great.
Can I make a comment? Speaking of baffling, I'm astounded by and beside myself to imagine the parade of people heading down through the city to a mass baptism in the James River. And I think that's something so fascinating about when we consider enslavement at large, and I intend the pun, and enslavement in the city, the absolute sheer danger to the enslavers of this massive group of people, you know, especially moving in mass under the leadership of an absolutely charismatic man with seemingly limitless power, as well as financial resources and connections across the country, let alone the Commonwealth, that it's almost astounding that he didn't foment, motivate, inspire an uprising that may be seen that could even be couched in religious terms, you know, and maybe even less esoteric than Nat Turner's. I wonder, Mr. Ross, whether there was any inclination or evidence of conspiracy to inspire an uprising.
No, we've never heard anything truly negative about Jasper. Jasper was a preacher, and he was a very fundamental. He believed the Bible literally, whatever it literally said. And Jasper for whatever reason, many white people liked him. They liked him a lot. And that's one of the reasons why he was able to live the life that he lived. As I indicated, the newspapers promoted him. I mean, in many ways, the newspapers had a lot to do with how he became so famous and how he became such a celebrity. You won't find many black people, many former slaves in the 19th century who was making headlines the way he did. And I find it interesting as to why did white people like him so much, in that they did not fear him at all. And in fact, they gave him a lot of room to maneuver. Many white people came to 6 Mount Zion all the time. The records indicate that there were special seats up front just for white people. And indeed, all of the politicians, if you came to Richmond from another state, I was reading an article that the governor of Pennsylvania came to Richmond to meet with the governor of Virginia, but his first stop was at 6 Mount Zion Church to hear Jasper before he even went to see the governor. So it's very interesting how he was able to garner the respect of whites, even though he was a slave, up until emancipation and certainly after that. They did not fear him, and he did not. In fact, I think he preached in many ways, don't hate your white brothers for what they did to you, but instead look to God's love to comfort you and move on with your life. So he did not preach or even indicate any kind of negative thoughts against whites, but rather turn to God's love and move on with your life. But one interesting thing about the Sunday Move sermon, and a lot of people have had their take on it, but one of the explanations, if you will, on it is that Jasper was saying to whites that if God could move the sun and make the earth square, which no one believed, but if God could do that, then God could change the hearts of men, and as a result, change many of the injustices that had occurred to African Americans during slavery.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Okay.
All right.
Well, Anna, I'm afraid we are getting to the point where we're setting up and getting ready for our Judy performance, but go ahead and close as you like.
Sure. No, what I'd like to do is ask if any one of our panelists have anything that they want our listeners to know about. If you have something coming up, you should let them know quickly now, and or put it in the chat for people to record. But yeah, go ahead. I'll give you 30 seconds to say if you've got something coming up you want them to know about.
Well, this is Benjamin Ross, and I'm going to quickly say next year, 2022, will be the 210th birthday of the Reverend John Jasper. And so I am racking my brains to come up with some event that will highlight him, the celebrity that he was, and hopefully reveal how did he even become a celebrity. We're working with the Black History Museum, possibly on a small exhibit of the Reverend John Jasper next year, the 4th of July.
That's great.
And I'll plug our media for the Park Service. Maggie Walker National Historic Site and Richmond National Battlefield Park have very active Facebook pages. So every time we come up with new stuff, we end up putting posts and videos there. And last year, I'm going to do an improved version of this at some point, but I just kind of grabbed a camera and went on a bus tour, which is the story of Mary Jane Richards Denman. Everything that I know as a source kind of compiled into a 45-minute sit-down sort of bus tour. And I'll do the improved version sometime. But if you want to know everything that I know about that massive, interesting story, go to the Richmond National Battlefield Park YouTube page, and you can check that out.
Terrific.
And I'll put a plug, the public reenactments at St. John's which offer the Patrick Henry Give Me Liberty or Death speech, are back on Sundays, and there's been a concerted effort to expand that history to include those who formerly haven't been included, and have people of color represented, and other, even women in the reenactments. And so I just wanted to, if you haven't been for a while, I encourage you to see some of the changes that we're making in that story.
Great, thank you. All right, Tim or Pam?
I would just quickly say that, as I mentioned, Richmond Hill's archaeology project, the Judy Project Archaeology sort of division, was envisioned as a community-focused and community-led and community-involved investigation. And I'm hoping that coming up, into the summer here, as we're moving beyond the pandemic, that we have opportunities to actually get people out into the field and to sit down and talk about, what kinds of questions are we going to answer, what kind of directions are we going to take. So something to look forward to. I also want to plug, and I've been talking about this all day, is it Richmond Story House, the Elizabeth Van Leeuw walking tour. It's a self-guided audio tour, and it is totally awesome. And it'll take you around the city. It'll take you, through the Civil War into the 1890s, towards her ultimate death and the erection of her headstone by the family of a man that she had cared for. I think that these walking tours can be a really great way to start to help people experience the connections between our respective sites and these stories. So, maybe the next time we get together, we can kind of talk about some of this, some ideas for that. Thank you.
So the last thing I'll do is plug Shockoe Bottom and the Memorial Park and the Shockoe Alliance Small Area Plan for the development of Shockoe Bottom. The issues, working out zoning and working out planning in an urban setting raises up so many of the dynamics that actually were talked about today, and in particular, Tim, some of the things that you referenced about how we should be thinking about the land under our feet and the tangibility of this history and our ability to access it and connect with it is now being worked into some of the urban planning policies of the city, but they are going to need help, and they're going to need, examples. They're going to need the voice of the community saying this matters to them in order for those policies to be supported. So sacredgroundproject.net is our website, and from there you can plug into everything that's happening around that. So at this point, I'll just say thank you so much for attending, for listening. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for giving us, the gift of their information and their minds at work, because we are in our way contributing to what future generations will understand about this place, Richmond, that we all call home. So thank you again, and please stay tuned for the next program as part of Richmond Hill's Juneteenth. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.